case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers, readers, all you people out there. It's I, Douglas Lain. I'm with Benjamin Studebaker here in Milwaukee. We've been spending the last couple days surrounded by Republicans, and it's not been so bad. Has it been bad?
Not that different from Indiana, really.
Okay, so yeah, we've noticed that you can spot the people who are going to the convention because they all look like they walked right out of the '80s. And we're going to be joined shortly by Chris Cutrone, and to discuss just what the meaning of this moment is for the country, for politics in general, but also for the left. So, Benjamin, what have you been thinking as you've been wandering around the RNC?
Well, I was kind of surprised that Trump picked Vance for VP.
Mm-hmm.
I really thought he would go with a governor, maybe somebody like Kim Reynolds from Iowa. I get the going with somebody from the Midwest. That makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't necessarily think he'd go with Vance. As somebody that I know from Indiana who's a Trump voter texted me and went, I can't believe that he picked Vance. This person had seen Hillbilly Elegy on Netflix and hated it and thinks it's just really obvious that Vance is a huckster
Mm-hmm.
and
Well,
he doesn't actually give a shit about poor people.
mm-hmm.
And so she said that she's not going to vote for Trump over that pick, even though she's previously voted for him. And I thought that was really something.
That is interesting. At this moment, it feels like everyone's going to have to vote for Trump. After all, the man was shot. And we have sympathy and empathy, and just out of the goodness of our hearts, we have to. And apparently, the New York Times. Apparently, I saw a headline that said we're all MAGA now. So, oh, we've got Ashley Frawley joining us here. Hi, Ashley.
Hello. Would have been very cool to actually be there, but I appreciate the reportage. Looks like we have to zoom out a bit. There we go. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna have
All right.
Chris Cutrone sitting here in just a moment or soon. So yeah, I wish you could be here too. But on the other hand, all you've missed really is wandering around in the hot sun. So uh, a lot of what we're capturing are just people on the street, interviews like that. But what are you feeling about it from across the pond
Well, it was
about
very
the
interesting. It was very interesting because I was at a wedding Saturday night. And we were on our way back from the wedding, and I was this is Ashley's woo moment. I'm going to totally ruin the seriousness of this stream, but I was thinking about, for some random reason, I was thinking about the JFK assassination, and I was thinking about it in great detail. And I get back to the hotel, and I turn on my phone, and I see that someone tried to shoot Trump. Or actually, it was very interesting because at first it was like, it was very funny. The headlines were all like, Trump falls at rally. That was the CNN headline. Like, bullets erupted. Like, they were trying very hard to avoid saying the quite dramatic thing that had happened. But anyways, I was thinking, oh my God, I intuited this. You get so into politics, eventually you just feel it through the ether. And that is basically what happened. Oh gosh. Nobody say that no one read that comment out loud. We're going to wind up on a list. Doug has learned his lesson. He got banned from Twitter for saying that, for saying similar things. Doug, you're muted.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay.
Anyways,
It's
so
not
I was
even gonna
following
mention
it.
RFK Jr. Go ahead.
So I was following it right from the very beginning. Like, I think I happened to have just looked at it was like it happened 2 minutes ago or something like that. And there was just one video feed of it. And I thought, man, this guy, he's so savvy in the sense of he can turn anything into a meme. He knows. You could just imagine him when he's on the ground there thinking, the man almost got shot in the head, and he's got the presence of mind to stand up and fist pump. Like, what the hell? Meanwhile, like, you got a choice between that and someone who literally gets lost on a stage like no guns involved whatsoever. The guy can't find his exit. Trump's got the president of mind to go USA. It's
Yeah,
you
that is a
couldn't make it up.
difference. Yeah, I think that it looked to me like that was I mean, I don't think that was so calculated. I think that was his legitimate response. That's what I think.
That's what I'm
But
saying. Like, I'm
yeah,
saying like
no.
that was his. Like it was. This man is like so in tune with how to turn something into a soundbite or like an image. It's just incredible. I
Mhm.
couldn't believe it when I saw it. I thought, oh, there he goes. He's won the election now.
Well, I'm wondering if this moment really does seal the deal in November. Not that it needed to be sealed any more than it already was, but um, Benjamin, what do you think? Are we overstating the case now that this is all wrapped up?
I think that Trump is probably going to win, but it's an election. You can never really be sure, especially with 4 months to go.
Hmm.
And I am hearing some people in Indiana who are becoming increasingly sympathetic to Biden because they feel that the Democrats are being disloyal to him and stabbing him in the back. In some way, all of the attempts to get rid of Biden have come across to some people as making him kind of an anti-establishment figure, even though he's the president, so it's kind
Hmm.
of ridiculous.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, there is this sense that because the Democratic Party establishment has turned on him, that he is now in some way a rebellious figure. And I think for people who are looking for entertainment value out of this,
Hmm.
having someone who is potentially senile and can't control what he says, it's competitive with Trump in terms of possibility for unintentional comedy.
That's a take. I think that idea of Biden as the another outsider candidate, um, is so free assassination attempt. Like I think that changed the dynamic. And um, look, when I saw what had happened, even though I knew that I didn't have the information in front of me, I couldn't possibly know. It just felt as though it was a culmination of the attempt by the Democrats to stop Trump. It just felt like it was just a final domino falling, and in this effort that had been norm breaking up to that point. I couldn't help but remember Tucker Carlson predicting that they were going to try to kill him. And so I don't think that that's actually what happened. I don't have any reason to believe that's what happened. I also don't think it was staged either. But I think the feeling, the zeitgeist is that this is the Democrats' last shot to stop him, and now there's no stopping him.
Yeah, I don't think we know yet enough to really say what the motivation of the would-be assassin was. I know that in many cases, when you have this kind of thing, the person is crazy and isn't even doing it for a political reason, but has just kind of lost the plot. Something's gone wrong in life, and there's a despair, and the despair isn't able to be expressed in a more constructive way. So I hesitate to draw conclusions from it. Nonetheless, I think you're right to suggest that many people will draw conclusions from it.
Yeah.
And many people will view it in this political way, regardless of whether or not the facts actually support that reading.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, on the flight from Las Vegas to Milwaukee, I was seated next to a couple of older white guys just like myself. I felt very comfortable. There was a guy who was my age and about coming up on 60. He was a Trump supporter. The other guy was a deadhead, and he was going to the RNC um, just for the vibe, I think, and because he was going to make a movie himself. But both of them brought up MK Ultra, and we're talking about how the shooter could have been up on the roof for so long ahead of time. And I just think that there's a feeling that Trump has overcome all of the obstacles that were being thrown in his way. And I also had this moment where I looked at that image of him with the flag behind him and blood on his face, raised fist, and worried that a president that would be that popular and kind of embody a certain kind of American spirit would possibly, for the first time, really be. There was an actual risk that he would be an authoritarian populist now, that he could be the kind of authoritarian that he couldn't be before. Um, but that's my old, maybe my inner leftist, the old style inner leftist still percolating around in it. So, oh, no, no, he is Hitler. Um, but it certainly does feel like he's got the momentum, stolen it from Joe. There's no more Joe momentum left. But again, that's all just my intuition and feelings, and that's a media narrative at the moment, so we should be skeptical about that.
Oh, we used to have more assassination attempts in American politics. They used to happen more often. People might remember Reagan, the couple attempts against Ford. Kennedy, of course, we know what happened there. These things used to happen more often, and they didn't necessarily have a huge dramatic effect when they used to happen. But I think one thing that has changed post 9/11 is that we have a kind of safetyist mentality where we think that nobody should ever be in danger of political violence, and that if it occurs, that this is a major break from normal. Well, really, in some ways, it's a return to a normal where the president is not completely safe all the time, where no political figure is completely safe all the time. But we've gotten used to this idea in the 21st century that the state can make people completely safe all the time. And that results in, I think, a bigger reaction to this than we would have seen in the 20th century.
Hmm. When's the last time there was an attempt on a president's life? Was it when they tried to get Clinton by flying a plane at the White House? Remember that?
It depends on how high your bar is. How close does the person have to have come? You
Mhm.
get arrested all the time for plotting. I remember one time Bush was traveling in the Middle East and I think somebody threw a grenade at him and the grenade didn't go off and didn't kill anybody, but I seem to remember, I could be wrong, an instance of that happening. Of course, there was the guy who threw the shoes at Bush.
Yeah, I don't think that counts as a.
It was a moment where the president and the security team aren't entirely able to control the situation, so it disrupts the sense that the security services have the situation totally under control.
Mhm.
And one of the functions of the conspiracy theory is to restore that sense of control by positing
Mm.
that the only way that the president could be in danger is if there was an inside job, if people within the state planned it, because no one wants to acknowledge the possibility that the state doesn't have total control.
Mm. Yeah.
It's a comforting kind of fiction, right? Because what you're saying is like somebody out there is pulling the strings. And the most terrifying thing is like there's nobody there. There's not, it's like it's not attached to anything. Anything could happen. That's incredibly, incredibly scary. The other thing too is that it kind of, yeah, it is an incredibly comforting illusion, this notion that don't worry, like this really weird, crazy thing happened. Like you could just get your head fucking blown off. Oh, excuse me. Like you just get your head blown off at random, that could happen. Somebody just, hey, think I'm gonna drag this gun up onto this roof and and then nothing will happen, so that's absolutely terrifying. The other thing too is that it's like I know this is a very common thing to say about conspiracy theories, but it's worth just sort of repeating. It's like saying, look, I know better than other people. I'm not duped. And we all kind of, like, we just said it right now. I know this is a mainstream media narrative, and so we have to be careful. Like, the mark of a thinking person is that you are careful and you are critical of a narrative that appears to be fed to you by mainstream media sources. And so this like part of us being us people, audiences, being media literate is often that we are supposed to question these things, question official narratives, and that just can lead into and breed conspiratorial thinking. Because, well, what is conspiratorial thinking if not simply questioning, sometimes in crazy ways, but not necessarily, the main narrative of the most obvious thing that happened has happened, right? But that's also what the mainstream media is saying. So what are you? Are you going to be a conspiracy theorist or are you going to be a dupe? Those are your choices.
I mean, that's how I feel. I don't want to be a dupe. I saw JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK. Recently watched the Parallax View, all about MK Ultra. And they're always telling us it was a lone assassin, worked a lone net. That's what they want us to think. But no, what I really feel is that um, it, we should expect to get as much information about the shooting and what happened as we possibly can. That there needs to be transparency, and that we're not likely to get it. Um, but I hope that in this case, because it was an attempted assassination, and and because it was a lone nut, right? If it was a lone nut, that we will be able to get a coherent, complete account of exactly what happened, why the Secret Service weren't able to do their job as effectively as they might normally have done. And I think expecting transparency is a that's a demand that is worth making, no matter what your politics are. Otherwise, Chris Cutrone just sat down next to me.
Good morning. Well, it's all children. No, you know what occurred to me as you guys were talking about this is when Trump was president, his opponents would always say that all of his rhetoric, I think that he even said every word out of his mouth is an impeachable offense.
Mhm.
And what they meant by that was that everything that he says might trigger some mentally ill person to act, right? And so you're not supposed to talk about really anything in a charged way. And this is what it meant for Trump to break the norms.
Mhm.
That the discursive norms had been established for how one talks about things, and I'm sure it had been, thoroughly researched and statistically proven
Mhm.
about the increased incidence of acts of violence in the community when certain public rhetoric is used. So all the media outlets, all the politicians, all the bureaucrats are trained to use certain language and not other language in order to supposedly decrease the incidence of violent acts by such lone individuals. So from a technocratic, bureaucratic perspective of management, they think that they have a scientific system down for mitigating against and reducing the incidence of these kinds of things. So all the mass shootings that take place are usually pegged to, and now social media leaves a track, and so people can say, oh, well, because they were looking at this website or that website or following this Twitter account or that Instagram account, this is causal. There's a causal relation between these actions and the public discourse.
And I noticed that JD Vance tweeted at the Democrats that they had, turned up the temperature and were partially responsible for the temperature.
Republicans are going to say it too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's not just the Democrats who are going to say it because this is, I would say, again, Doug, like people of our generation, I think that people started talking about this way around the time of the Hinckley attempt on Reagan.
Oh yeah.
Right. I think that we can trace it back that far. We can say that once it was decided, okay, there really isn't a political motive, there's more of a mental health issue. And then the issue is how public discourse and how heated public political rhetoric triggers such people, in some way, that people start talking about it in these terms. And therefore, it's the responsibility of politicians to follow a pretty tight protocol.
If we were ever have a socialist politician in a socialist party
They would violate it by,
every day.
of course.
Yeah.
They would violate it, of course. I already said this about Bernie in 2016. They
Yeah.
didn't say it only about Trump, they said it about Bernie as well. That things that he was saying, things that he was raising, topics that he was focusing on were, dangerous. They were disruptive of norms. They were, just raising expectations that are unrealistic. And that's a bad move and is ultimately unsafe.
So, over the last year and a half, I've been very concerned about free speech. I mean, I've always been a free speech advocate, and
Mhm.
back in 2002, protest against the Patriot Act, and so that's continued to define my politics. But there was a moment there with the weaponizations of government hearings that it looked like the Republicans were taking up free speech as a definitive part of their
Mhm.
politics. Um, and I feel like with JD Vance making the claims that he did on Twitter and the shift in the narratives, that's going to go away. Do you think that we're going to be seeing a continuation of the abridgment of our rights under Trump if he gets reelected?
I mean, there's a kind of bureaucratic logic to it, regardless of which party is in power.
Mhm.
But I think that you're focused on another aspect of it, which is that because each party accuses the other party,
Mhm.
that they contribute, they kind of help motivate this bureaucratic logic.
Mhm.
meaning that there's a kind of tightening of rules that follow from each exchange of heated rhetoric by the parties.
Hmm. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I saw on Twitter Anton Yeager tweeted a quote from Trotsky about the effect of assassination is just to increase securitization and policing.
Hmm.
And I do think that Chris is right to suggest that both parties play a role in this because both parties accuse each other. The concept of democracy is contested, and therefore the concept of what kind of speech is democratic speech is contested.
Hmm.
And
Just undermining.
yeah, versus undermining. I'm also seeing a lot of discussion of stochastic terror.
Oh, yeah.
Seeing that a lot on social media. What do you think of that one, Chris?
Remind us of what stochastic means?
Yeah, this is terror that comes from speech. The idea that speech itself is terrorizing.
But okay, but it's a kind of confusing language. So stochastic means like apparently random, and yet,
Hmm.
right, we can sort of discern some kind of pattern in the randomness. Um, and so this is exactly what I mean. There's a kind of, I would say, a pseudoscience to these things. And uh, yeah, I mean, Trotsky belongs to a different tradition. So he belongs to the older Marxist tradition, which opposed the propaganda of the deed, the exemplary act, and assassination um, of responsible parties, politicians, state officials who literally have blood on their hands by anarchists, right? So part of their argument, although it wasn't the most prominent, it's not the first foot forward in the argument, is that it serves to increase state repression, and therefore you can't ever quite delineate the difference between an authentic actor and an agent provocateur. And the Russian movement was, of course, full of many examples of this, where the state did support the terrorists, and including against each other. They pit, radicals against each other, but they also fought their own bureaucratic battles by having people try to assassinate their bureaucratic rivals
Mm.
in the state
Mm.
too. And so it's kind of like, well, so who's the terrorist? So the Marxist point, of course, would be to say, well, of course, the real terrorist is the state. And these people, these romantic, heroic revolutionaries, whether wittingly or not, are serving the state.
Yeah, I would point out just the obvious thing, which is that stochastic terrorism is a concept which should not be allowed to have legs politically or in any kind of legislation, because it goes against the harm principle that John Stuart Mill established, which has been codified into the First Amendment. So the idea that speech could have a knockdown effect and then be responsible for somebody else's violent act.
It was
It's
bottomless. In other words, once you get in that road, there's no inherent limit to that logic.
right.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that that is something that spills out of hand. Of course, a certain amount of violence is always in politics.
Hmm.
And I think part of the trouble that people have is that they don't have tolerance for that.
Hmm.
There is a view increasingly that violence just shouldn't occur in politics, or that politics is the absence of violence, that it's a kind of Arendtian speech
Hmm.
action
Hmm.
that is the negation of violence. Now, some people react to that in a kind of Schmittian way and try to frame politics as exclusively
Right, violence. Right.
but it's neither side of that.
Hmm.
Politics sits in between violence and nonviolence.
Hmm. No, that's certainly true. I mean, I think that I guess where I'm coming from with it is how Marxists would situate that problem. And part of the difficulty is that we've lived through a recent era in which everything is violence. Meaning feeling triggered means that there's violence, or the microaggression,
Hmm.
right? So the corporate human resources training, don't commit microaggressions. But it turns out you can't help but commit microaggressions because microaggressions are in the eye of the beholder. So all you can do is be as aware as possible and to take as much responsibility for the consequences of your actions as you possibly can. But again, it becomes a kind of a bottomless logic to that. And so speech being violence, right? We've gone from that to actual violence,
Mhm.
right? And we've turned on a dime with that. And so that's worth remarking as well. And I think that the notion of stochastic terrorism, violence being triggered by social media phenomena and by political rhetoric in the public discourse more generally, is part and parcel of that, right? The inability to separate speech and expression from violence. There was an interview that I saw. It's interesting. It was among right wingers, and there was almost a kind of psychoanalytic. I think that I'm forgetting who the figures were now, but in which it was acknowledged. I think that it was a professor at Hillsdale College, of all places, talking to an author, a conservative author, and they used the term aggression rather than violence. And I think the Hillsdale professor said, "Well, of course, you as an author writing and publishing a book is an act of aggression, right?" And so it went into a kind of almost psychoanalytic realm of, and then the question is, well, but of course, that's an acceptable form of aggression.
Mm.
Except if when it's not, meaning if it's offensive, then it is an acceptable form of aggression. It's not a microaggression, it's a kind of a grand aggression, meaning, you're putting it out there, it's published, it's there on the store shelf to like scream at the person who might be triggered by it. Right, that's no mere microaggression.
Mm.
And yet, so this is where we would maybe defend Arendt, which is that a modern form of politics has to accept the aggressivity of public discourse without reducing it to violence. Right?
In the Comments on Society of Spectacle, I'm so sorry to be in such a situation, but
It's Celtic terror.
there's a line where it says, we live in a society today where you can plot an assassination by publishing a novel.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right. The anarchist book. It's a novel, and yet, of course, it is. When I read it as if I were reading a novel.
right. But
Can
so
I
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go.
go? No, 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 Doug, finish your thought. I thought you had finished.
No, I
So go
didn't
ahead.
really have more. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was just gonna say that I it might be my connection, but perhaps I missed this if you did say it. But I'm not sure that there is an expectation that there won't be violence. I think there's almost a hopeful expectation that there will be violence in order to confirm everything that we know about the dangers of democracy. So it's like there's constant warnings. Oh, those Trump supporters, and this. If you keep talking like this, they're gonna get violent. Those people, they're just like there's this like thin bubble of rationality that separates the unruly masses from just like losing their losing it and attacking those in power. And what's interesting too is that they didn't care about saying all that stuff about Trump being dangerous, Trump being the next Hitler, and all these pictures and talking about Trump supporters as all these terrible things, and during COVID, depicting them as giant viruses wearing red caps. That's all fine. That's all fine. All that dehumanization, because it was like, well, look, they were expecting the violence only to ever come from the great unwashed toward them. And if it was in the other direction, directed at Trump, so what? Good. How many people have I talked to in the last couple of days that said, damn, what a shame he missed. They were fine with that. It's not, there isn't an expectation that there won't be violence. There is an expectation to prove everything that's wrong with democracy and also to live out people's daydreams.
That's the idea. So, we're also not only in in the recent period do we have microaggression, but we also had harm reduction as a principle. And that's also, I would consider, unwieldy and inherently invidious to any kind of political perspective. So, what the thought that occurred to me about the 20-year-old shooter, the would-be assassin of Trump, is that he thought that it was worth it to prevent 4 more years of Trump, and he was willing to sacrifice 60 more years of his own life. Pure sophistry. But of course, you could also say, well, maybe in assassinating Trump, you're going to save X number of thousands of Palestinians, or perhaps if you were to assassinate Biden, you might save X number of tens of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians. Right? So, it's kind of like, Or let's say that Trump had been assassinated in COVID, then of course I'm sure that there would have been all sorts of statistical curve analysis that would have said, well, this saved us from millions of COVID deaths, Trump being assassinated.
Mhm.
They certainly thought that Trump being unelected in 2020 somehow saved people from COVID, even though, of course, more people died under Biden than under Trump. So that's always there. I would say that's the implicit logic. Or, your favorite example, which is that the Black Lives Matter protests were justified under the COVID lockdowns because racism is a public health issue and perhaps a greater public health issue than COVID.
Mhm.
Well, how do you measure that? Right? If you measure it in terms of like harm done to African Americans by structural racism, then a case could be made that more African Americans in the long run are going to suffer and die from racism than from COVID.
Yeah. The problem with that logic is even if you grant all that, the idea that the protests would be a cure,
I mean, so that you grant that somehow the protests are actually going to help overcome racism.
right? Which is no guarantee of that. So that's a
Really
political.
no guarantee, but also highly implausible.
This is a um,
There was a moment of arrogance there on the part of experts who felt that they could say definitively in no uncertain terms that having those protests would be better in some consequentialist way than not having them. And it was arrogant of them to think that they knew that. It was even more arrogant of them to think that they could, by speaking as experts, establish a consensus among people that that was true.
Politically, right.
Yeah, and I think that what we're seeing here is that at this point we have so much disagreement about everything that people are not able to tolerate hearing language that doesn't fit into their view. They immediately characterize it as mad or crazy. And when you start viewing other people as mad or crazy, then you have a fractious multitude which requires Bayesian state action.
Hmm.
the other side of all this is that both Black Lives Matter and the January 6th protests and riots and the Proud Boys and the Patriot people or whatever, I forget their name, all of them have been accused of being state actors. Black Lives Matter actually was mentioned in the Transition Integrity Report. Podesta said, as he was running a drill, of what to do if Trump gets reelected or refuses to leave office. This is in 2020. They said one of the tactics they could use is to deploy Black Lives Matter protesters on the streets as a pressure tactic to try to remove him from office.
What is the thing with Podesta is?
John Podesta, he was the head of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016.
He had a prominent role in the old Bill Clinton administration too, didn't
Right, yeah. Um, he was
he? Leads the Democratic Party.
at the center of Pizzagate.
Ah,
Um,
he was seen as himself running the pedophile ring.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because I got all these emails where it would say things like, I like pepperoni pizza. So that was clear evidence of something.
Language.
That is stochastic terrorism was what that was. In any case, we should think about how our own protest movements can be perceived, as you were talking about before, with the assassinations in the 19th century. Uh, our own protest movements can be seen as a kind of state action and state violence. Um, and I think one of the things that the left, socialist left, should protect against is being manipulated.
Yeah, it's something that the state's going to make use of in any case, right? So in other words, to call it state action is perhaps to engage in the same kind of casuistry as the people we're criticizing.
Yeah.
So I would say no. We should say that the state will make use of it. And so really the issue for the Marxist critique of the anarchists was that this is not the way social revolution is going to happen. Right, that's what it means to say that it's tantamount to a state action, in that it's not going to actually dislodge capitalism or the capitalist state, and so therefore, it is counterproductive. And the bottom line for them was not about state reaction, though. The bottom line for them was this was a poor substitute for organizing the working class, and it did nothing to further to help organizing the working class.
Well, I think on that point, people who are protesting think that they're speaking to society or building some kind of consensus or general will in society.
Hmm.
But most of the time, especially in the mass media environment that we have, they are persuading their fellow citizens that they are nuts, that there is a craziness problem that requires state intervention.
Hmm.
Mm. Well, that's one thing that they might be doing is persuading each other that they can't work together. The other thing that they, I think, do is try to protect the boundaries between the two parties and
Keep the
enforce,
game going.
yeah, enforce discipline. We went to a protest, a counter protest against the Republicans, an anti-Trump protest. It had a lot of other aspects to it. It was a BLM protest to a degree. It was
Mm.
a Palestine protest. It was a land back
Land back, yeah. There we
protest.
go.
It's the classic problem with the left-wing protests, too many demands.
Yeah. Um, and I spoke to a few people there. We've been doing interviews. You might notice that there are, I'm not sure if the camera people have been walking behind us or not, but we're being filmed for the film right now as well as through the little webcam. But when we were out on the streets, I was interviewing people at that protest, and I was asking them, so why are you here? Why are you in this protest? Rather than talking to people across the street. If you're like, for instance, there was a man there who said his whole job and his political action was to help getting the vote, specifically for Latino and Black people. Um, and so you're working for the Democratic Party to get out the vote for the Democrats. He says, "I just try to get out the vote. That's all I can say." But
Mhm.
the I asked him, "So why aren't you going across the street?" And the answer was it was kind of they were puzzled. He was puzzled as to because that hadn't occurred to him to do. And his friend started in on a conversation with me about he had been yelling at a pro Israel Republican, and he called him a baby killer. I said, you're supporting the bombing of children. Um, and I asked him, so did you inquire as to why he supports Israel? Did you
Mhm.
try to discuss with him why he likes Trump? Um, and that hadn't occurred to him either. So there's an insularity to the way politics works. I think on both sides, but certainly on in the left as well.
What's crazier, actually trying to persuade somebody or not bothering?
Right.
I think that not bothering is crazier. I'm going to stick by that idealistic
I
principle.
think we're getting to a point where actually trying to persuade somebody seems nuts.
It
If you
seems
saw someone who actually went and tried to talk to these people as a resistance leader, that would seem nuts to
Mm.
most of us.
It would seem quaint. It would seem naive.
At least quixotic.
Mhm.
And quixotism is a kind of madness.
It is. It is. So here's the thing. So does the assassination attempt actually help Trump? Right? So what we were just talking about, um, or does it further taint Trump with the association with craziness, with chaotic politics and out of control society? Meaning, does it tar him with, oh, if we get Trump back, it's going to be more of this,
You-
right?
you-
But it might actually hurt his candidacy, his chances for election, the fact that someone did try to assassinate him. Because it seems like, well, if we get Trump, then we're taking this turn in American politics. We're taking the turn into assassination. A very different effect would occur if someone had tried to assassinate Biden, I think.
Mhm.
But I think that because Trump is already associated with chaos, he was called a chaos candidate by his Republican opponents
Yeah.
in primaries in 2016. And this is what they meant. They actually did mean that there will be actual social and political violence as a consequence of uncontrolled rhetoric,
Mhm.
right? It's a chaos candidate because it will unravel the Republican Party. And if you unravel the Republican Party, then indeed you will let loose the crazies.
Yeah, but I mean, am I hallucinating or did I see a New York Times editorial headline that said we're all MAGA now? I mean, I think that when Trump stood up, blood on his face, raised his fist with the American flag behind him,
Depends what MAGA means.
huh?
It depends on what MAGA means.
Yeah, well, right. But my point is just that he may be the chaos candidate, but he's also the someone who's perceived now to be fighting for American people. By
Yeah, but maybe we don't want to fight. So Bernie Sanders made a statement
Mhm.
in which he said politics should be boring. He's saying, of course, the stakes are high and things matter, but politics itself, we're just having policy debates, and that should be relatively boring. Like, yes, it matters how many people get, um, you know, uh, government support for their health care and how much that support is, but no one should be assassinating anyone over it. No one should lose their temper over it. And it's like, well, wait, you're talking about life and death.
Mhm.
How is that
Well,
not going to be
that's
something that people lose their temper over?
Mhm.
That's a really, really interesting point because, my instinct is to kind of push back against that and be like, no, that's what the neoliberals want. They want boring politics, so he will just shut down and just let the adults, get on with
Pure
things. But on
technocracy.
the but on the other hand, we are like role playing insurrection and all this bullshit over like what? Like what actual fundamental deep changes are we actually talking about? What are we fighting? We are live action role playing revolutionary politics, but the content is empty. It's all just a big show for us. The culture war became real. It's becoming real. It's like bleeding out literally everywhere. But it's
The
just
policy
over
wonks would say
stupid
it's not empty.
things.
They would say it's not
Sorry?
empty. The policy wonks would say it's not empty. In other words, it has real consequences, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy. It has real effects in the world. And yes, it's all hidden behind this kind of bureaucratic haze, and intentionally so. And yet, wars actually break out. And that might be a consequence of this policy or that policy. It becomes very murky, doesn't it?
Sure, of course, but do you think that anything would actually be any different without all the rabble? Like it would just be a boring
It might
facade,
actually
a
matter.
boring
Biden
fight.
versus Trump might matter in terms of wars breaking out in this part of the world or that part of the world and hundreds of thousands of people dying, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
but
it's opaque
is that
to
the
us how
headline?
it is. Hmm.
But is that the headline that people are actually fighting about and losing their shit over?
I don't know.
No,
That's
it's
what they'll
like
say.
that's not what's actually happening. I do think like
Hmm.
there are consequences to politics. Hence, my reaction is no, that's wrong. But also, I
Hmm.
think what we're actually fighting over and like at each other's throats
It's
over
unclear.
is like
Yeah,
a role
it's
play.
unfair. It's unfair.
I remember, back in 2020, I was on Kitty Hopper's show and I debated Aaron Mate about who would cause more death ultimately, Trump or Biden. His argument was that we know for a fact that Trump is the one who will cause more death because he will start a war in Iran. That was his argument.
Uh-huh.
But also, look, the thing is, each of these presidential administrations, there are wars that begin that nobody runs on, that nobody predicts, and that nobody can say during the election, guaranteed for sure this will or won't happen.
This policy will guarantee not having a war or preventing a war or not.
Yeah, so of course it matters who gets elected because the foreign policy crises will be handled differently depending on who's elected. But you can't really vote based on that, except in the broadest possible sense of, who do you think is prudent?
Right. It's pure sentimentality.
Yeah, I wanted to just throw in a thought, which is that I do not think that most people, most Republicans, when they see Trump bloodied with the hand in the air and the American flag behind him, are thinking that he's going to be fighting for or against a foreign enemy. Like he's not going to be trying to stop a war or start a war. He's fighting for them, and what that means is he's fighting to give them a voice in the political arena. That's how they perceive it. I mean, just to be really naive about it, that they want to have a representative, they feel unrepresented, and but when he stands up and says he's going to fight, 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 that's what he's going to fight for to give them political power.
My armchair analysis is, or dumb store analysis,
Mhm.
whichever, maybe an armchair at the dumb store,
Yeah, that'd be great.
is that, it's a wash, really. In terms of domestic terrorism, let's say.
Mhm.
Does Trump keep the far right under control? Meaning, are they more likely to explode into terroristic acts if they feel entirely silenced by the Democrats, or if they feel like they have some marginal corner of the table under the Republicans? And similarly, left-wing violence. is left-wing violence furthered by a Republican administration, or rather, perhaps by a Democrat administration, meaning frustration with a Democratic administration might actually generate terrorism. We have the precedent of the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago and being a kind of chaotic event, and domestic terrorism exploding in the aftermath of that. And so, was that a consequence of the crisis of the Democratic Party and its inability to control its own constituents? Or was it in reaction to Nixon winning? And of course, Nixon winning was a consequence of the chaos in the Democratic Party. So, how do you disentangle these things in fact?
Yeah, but I think those are kind of the wrong sorts of questions, actually,
Maybe.
because I think the question should be for socialists,
Mhm.
like, did the unrest and the organizing to generate that have any positive effect in terms of empowering everyday people to have more control over their government? And it was specifically working people.
I actually see Biden and the inevitable policy conundrums of things like Israel-Palestine as likely to generate left-wing terrorism. Um, by contrast with Trump, I do. But again, that's my armchair dentist analysis. But
Certainly all of this stuff anyways, as you point out.
yeah.
So it just becomes a question of who we want to blame and who decides the power of the president, right?
Right.
Ultimately,
Right.
if I think at this point, almost everybody, including many people who don't want to think it,
Mhm.
think that large segments of the population are crazy, including people who wish that they didn't think that way,
Mhm.
because they recognize that thinking that way is barbarizing
Mhm.
and is a form of barbarization. The only way that we can continue to do politics in a context where we think lots of people are crazy is to not think like Hobbes.
Right.
And the way in which we don't think like Hobbes is that we prioritize survival less than Hobbes does.
You know what I heard you say when you said Hobbes? I thought you said think like cops.
Well,
Which is also the case.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go into Ashley here because I'm going to say to you, not only do people think that the other guy is crazy, but more and more we think we ourselves are crazy, and we're encouraged to do so.
You mean we
And
doubt ourselves?
we doubt ourselves, not only like
Gaslighting.
we gaslight ourselves, but we're like, you know, instructed or encouraged to seek therapy for the most minor emotional troubles that we might be having, or for major ones that we might be able to adequately cope with.
Is being upset about politics a subject for therapy? Maybe, maybe not.
Well, I mean, look, my ex-wife was studying to be a nurse when Trump was elected, and when she went to school that day, everyone was told that if they needed a counseling session, one would be available after the election of Trump. And
This
Be
was
nice to-
like a gift to me when I was writing my second book. It was just like I was like save, screenshot. It was just everywhere. It was like it was just really hard. Okay, we all got together and we all just had like a big cry, and then it was like, and people and professionals were like, if and they do this every single time. They're like, if patients think that they need a break from politics, they should blah blah blah. And you're like, hold on a second, who are the patients? And they mean the entire electorate. Like everybody in these moments, everybody becomes a patient in waiting. And because in these moments, it's the most obvious expression of therapy culture. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, in therapy culture, these are mental illnesses.
Mhm.
This is insanity.
Mhm.
If you're diagnosing people with mental illnesses, you're diagnosing them as crazy.
Mhm.
It contributes to the fractious multitude framing that we all increasingly have internalized.
Mhm. Which I
And when you
myself
point
don't
out
really
something
believe
like
in.
that, they'll correct your language. Because I remember that I sat through sorry, I don't want to derail the conversation, but I remember
Yeah.
I sat through like a one of these Thursday seminars we used to have at Kent years ago, and this woman was like giving a seminar, and she's like, did this like emotional well-being thing, and she was like, one thing that we have to notice is that I can't remember the thing that she called it. It was they'd renamed it something like emotional. Oh, I think they were calling it emotional and learning difficulties. And as I was watching it, I was like, oh my God, this is the bell curve. Because she was basically saying they were doing it in prisons, and they were like, and she was like, oh, the Black people, especially, we have to be, it's awful, because of the legacy of this and that. Particularly the Black people in prisons are scoring really low on our questionnaire of emotional and cognitive abilities. And I was like, I put up my hand and I said, this reminds me of the bell curve where they basically said like 30% of Black people are retarded. And that's what you're saying. You just like said it in nicer language. And I remember this like this collective intake of breath in the room. And the woman looks at me stunned and she gave me a lecture. She says, you sound American. We don't use that word here in the UK. And I was like, so you point
Oh
out what you're
boy.
really saying
Well,
here is everybody is crazy. You'll get a lecture on language instead of saying, "Oh, you are the one who's saying this. You are the one who's saying that these people are unsuited to democracy, rights, et cetera, et cetera." But you're just saying it nicely. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, just make a plea for Horkheimer and Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment, which I know people are not a fan of, when they talked about the inherent ambiguity of democratically minded people implementing minority policies, namely for the benefit of minorities. Vis-a-vis racism, meaning are political measures meant to ameliorate racism, in fact, simply institutionalizing it.
Hmm.
Right. And so there's that inherent ambiguity in any, not just the discourse, in the actual policies and the actual measures taken, to use a Brecht expression. To bring it back to the political realm, though, again, what do we want out of this? So crisis management serves the bureaucracy and the technocracy very well, right? If everything is, mental health crisis, for example, the example that you were focusing on, Ashley, but foreign policy crisis, then it suits it to defer to the experts, doesn't it? Right? If we're just going from one state of emergency to another. So the Schmidt point, the interesting thing about Schmidt, so in Platypus, we've been reading Arendt and also Schmidt and others, James Burnham, this summer. And Schmidt thought that politics was ennobling, meaning the attempt to pathologize or criminalize politics was inherently dehumanizing. And he accused liberalism of doing that. And, the kernel of truth to this. But his answer was that actually politics and political struggle and political antagonism and fighting is what ennobles humanity. And I use that word very deliberately because, in fact, his model for this is feudalism, meaning that politics was ennobling in the feudal era, and bourgeois liberalism did away with politics when it did away with feudalism. Whereas I would make the opposite point, in fact, and I think that I'd be on good ground with Marxism, which is to say that actually feudalism was not politics, and that only in bourgeois society and only in liberalism do we actually have politics. And therefore, there's this question of what we mean by politics. And it's not the dignity of being treated as an enemy. It actually isn't the essence of politics. Whether done through violence or done through discourse, right? That's not the way it should be understood. And nor should it be this consensus mongering in which we defer to experts, in which we basically say, well, of course, we need to study this and try to take a scientific approach and depoliticize it that way. Right, so I would say that those are the two sort of extremes that we seem to be constantly oscillating between a drastically antagonistic notion of politics via Schmidt and a kind of attempt at depoliticization via a kind of a technocratic, bureaucratic rationality, which is itself a form of politics. But really, it's a sort of driving of politics into a subterranean realm that's intractable.
I'm going to be a Pollyanna and say there's another kind of politics, which is socialist politics,
Maybe.
which is based on solidarity, and not opposition so much. But I wanted to ask you,
Solidarity forever, Doug.
yeah, exactly.
Solidarity forever. Yeah, I'm not so sure.
Okay, so
And you seem to want to say something.
Yeah, I do want to say something.
I want to ask you a question, but go ahead. You go first.
Yeah, I think politics begins when there is a need for legitimation. And if there's an audience for legitimation, then politics is occurring.
Uh-huh.
And I think that the form politics takes changes as the audience for legitimation changes and the content of legitimation stories changes and the various responses that are open to people who don't believe in the stories change. But I do think that politics occurred in the Middle Ages. And I do think
Sure.
politics occurred in feudalism in that sense.
Among the
Aristotles
aristocracy.
in other sense. Yeah, yeah.
But only among them.
Yes.
Okay.
That is politics.
We're coming up on an hour here. I want you guys to stick around for the second hour for the on the
It
Patreon.
gets juicy.
And you guys can go at it and have some politics. But what I and you know, not the socialist kind, the sentimental kind that I espouse. But I want to ask first a question based on one of the comments that flowed by,
In
and
the
it's like,
chat.
oh yeah, it's Cutrone, the author of Why Not Trump?
What?
What's he doing here? And so I want to ask you,
What am I doing?
you know, any of us do that. No, the question I want to ask you is, would you consider now writing that essay again with this, at least a different essay, but with the same title, Why Not Trump? And the answer, like what you would you be doing in the essay, is actually trying to find reasons why we shouldn't support Trump, rather than you know, the way you had written it before, which is to say it's not going to be the end of the world. It's not going to be, he's not such a big deal. There are nothing to be afraid of, which is kind of what you wrote the first time. This time, I'm wondering if we may need to remind
Arguments.
parts of the left that, you know, this change, it might seem dramatic, and that which the media is
Mm,
going to be selling us as a legitimate change, um, really won't be able to accomplish
mm,
what we're trying to aim.
I see what you mean. Well, I mean, well, said in the 2016 article. So it's written in the summer of 2016 before he was elected. It's perhaps after it is after he got the nomination.
Hmm.
And the issues of the day were quite different. So about the only issue that was raised around the 2016 election in terms of Trump being a threat was Russia. And the occasion for that was, and you know, we have to sort of dust off our memory here, was the Syrian civil war. It was the Saudi versus Russia competition in and through the bodies of the Syrian population. And it had a lot to do with oil prices. It had a lot to do with ability to fund the different factions. And one of the things that Trump said was, well, we should not take the Saudi side. We should sort of rise above and use the competition between the Saudis and the Russians and the Iranians to American advantage to manage the Middle East better than is clearly the case. And that was enough
Hmm.
to accuse him of being Putin's stooge.
Right.
Okay, so this is after the Crimea War, but before the current Ukrainian war, and unclear that the current Ukrainian war would in fact break out, so that Trump could simultaneously accuse the Obama administration of not militarily supporting Ukraine enough
Hmm.
and doing too much to antagonize Russia,
Right.
right? So, you know, there wasn't as much for me to kind of go through, whereas now I feel like, well, I could write a book, like all the reasons that people give for being opposed to Trump and sort of disputing each and every one of them. But you know that that's not my style.
Actually be for Trump. That's what I'm saying. Like we need to.
Because it's likely that he'll be elected, that we have to remind ourselves why we need to be opposed to him.
Yeah.
We'll make that argument adequately.
Okay.
Not from a socialist perspective, but from a liberal perspective. In
Right.
other words, I'm not sure. What I'd say is, you know, strictly speaking, from a socialist perspective, there isn't a reason to prefer one over the other. And I did actually chart that out between my two prior essays on Trump, 2016 and 2020. The 2020 essay being, well, Trump is promising jobs. He's, you know, saying we should dismantle the carceral state and employ these people. And isn't that where socialists should be? Aren't socialists going to benefit from higher rates of labor participation, employment? And of course, you know, aren't socialists like liberals against the carceral state? Right? Because you don't have to be a socialist to be against the carceral state by any means.
Mhm.
You can actually be opposed to the carceral state on purely utilitarian grounds,
Mhm,
right? You could say cost benefit. Is this really, right?
mhm.
Is it does it pass muster in a cost benefit analysis to uh, uh, incarcerate a murderer for life?
I feel like we're in a moment now where maybe some socialists will be trying to reach out to people where to say, I don't prefer one over the other, won't be perceived as being soft on Trump. It will be perceived as being too hard on Trump, not giving him enough credit. And that might be a reason why.
Mhm.
By people we're going to try to organize or talk to or reach out to who might be working class and supporting Trump and feeling like this is going to really alter their
I have an
lives.
old-fashioned view of this, which
Mhm,
is that the working class tends not to vote, and for good reason,
mhm,
and that there's only a marginal swing vote among the working class.
mhm,
And that swing vote is very mercurial, and it may not be thoroughly reasoned through. There's a healthy kick the bums out, right? There's a reason why the administrations tend to oscillate every 8 years between the parties, right? Which is that we've given these guys a chance, they failed, let's give the other guys a chance. And very tempered expectations with respect to that. No one has great expectations in either party in the working class. And that is kind of neither here nor there with respect to organizing the working class for socialism.
Yeah, I'm absolutely on board with that. I think for the most part we have a subaltern population, and that claims on either party's behalf to speak for those people should be treated with
Bogus.
great suspicion.
Yes,
Right. No matter who's making it, and no matter how hard the take seems to be.
right. That's right. So I never made the argument that the working class would benefit from Trump.
I know you never did. I'm just saying we may need to make that argument now.
Or the Penn argument.
Right.
Or
Yeah.
both.
Right. Yeah. All right. Listen, we've been talking for an hour, and I want to wrap it up. But if you enjoyed this first half, join us in the Patreon in about 20 minutes, where we'll do another 45 minutes or so. Then we have to go to the RNC and I'm going to try to convert all the Republicans to socialism.
To make it revolutionary again.
Right. All right. So let's see if I can run this. And Ashley, we'll hopefully you'll join us in the second half as well. I know you didn't get to talk as much this time. Do you have anything you want to say at the end?
In
No,
the
we'll
case
save
of
it for
nuclear
the
or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets